Ways and Means Committee of the Board of Aldermen is now called to order. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Alderwoman Krewson, Alderwoman Florida, Alderwoman Baringer,
Present.
Alderman Williamson,
Here.
Alderman Moore, Alderman French,
Present.
Alderman Vaccaro,
Present.
Alderman Carter,
Present.
Kennedy.
Here.
6 present, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. We're here. We have several items on the agenda, including a board bill and a resolution, as well as a review of the mid-year budget report. I think we'd start out with, first of all, Board Bill 88, sponsored by Alderman Cohn. We do have a summary report from him. You can take that this way.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the committee. I appreciate your time this morning. Board Bill 88 is fairly straightforward. We've done a couple of these in the past. Essentially what this is doing is creating a City Hall restoration fund, and that fund would be added to the tax bills that go out from the Collector of Revenue's office. And then the purpose of those funds would obviously be to help repair and restore the building which we are currently in.
Questions from members of the committee. Alderwoman Baringer. You need a moment?
I need a moment, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Alderman Williamson.
Yes, thank you. So presently where the funds are being directed to now?
There are no funds being directed at this point. This would be an option for anyone in the city of St. Louis that receives a bill to check off on that bill that they would like to contribute to the fund. Mm-hmm. So there is no fund currently, and there's no monies being collected for that purpose at this point. Mm-hmm. So this would be a new option for taxpayers in the city to help support the restoration of City Hall.
It was basically up to the taxpayers or the residents if they'll like
to elect it.
Right.
Right.
And out of that bill, what's the percentage? How much would be directed toward the restoration fund?
Whatever they choose to give to the fund. So, it's completely their option, whether it's $1 or $10.
I see. So if my bill is, $800 or whatever it may be, then I can put on $15, $20, make it $815, $820, and that $20 will go to the restoration fund.
Exactly.
Okay.
At your choosing. You could just pay the $800. Right. We'd be happy with that too.
Right. Thank you.
We'd like to go back to Alderwoman Baringer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is where it goes on the bill and there's a little checkoff box, correct? Okay. And historically, I thought we had looked at doing this, as in the cost of putting it on the bill. So did we already talk to the Collector of Revenue's office to find out when it could cycle in?
I talked to Tom Vollmer in the Collector of Revenue's office. It was actually mid last year when I had a conversation with him. He was actually hoping that we could get this passed last year so that we could get it on the end of year billing cycle, but they're supportive of putting it on there, and they said that as soon as we can pass it, they'll add it to the next cycle of bills that go out. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then correct me if I'm wrong, for any of you here who remember, but didn't we say that if something like that doesn't collect so much money within a certain time frame, it gets taken off that bill? Correct.
If it doesn't collect more than $10,000 in a year, then it would be automatically removed from the bill.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
So, but the I guess secondary part of this is that the fund would still remain even if it's not on the bill. So people would still have the option to contribute to this fund even though it's not on the bill. So there's two parts to this. One is actually the creation of the restoration fund, and the second part is adding it to the bill.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Alderman French.
No questions.
Alderman Vaccaro.
I'm just curious if I remember, I think everything got kicked off, didn't it?
That's my understanding, is that, on an annualized basis, there's about $40,000 a year that gets collected through the various activities that are collected on the bill. And last year was the first year that none of them reached that $10,000 threshold that we put in place, I think, 2 years ago. So yes, this would be a fresh start for the allocation. calculations, yeah.
That'd be the only thing on there. I just, no questions.
And I mean, to that point as well, there's a lot of work that needs to go into this. This bill and this fund, obviously, $40,000 a year isn't nearly enough to cover the maintenance and restoration costs for City Hall. So, I think the important part of this is really the establishment of the fund so that we can start, working on how to do additional fundraising for the improvements here.
Thank you.
Okay. Alderman Carter?
No questions.
Alderwoman Krewson?
No questions.
Alderwoman Florida?
I would like to be a co-sponsor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Were there any other questions from members of the committee? If not, do you have any?
No, I appreciate the questions and conversation and, would appreciate your favorable consideration.
Okay. With that, we can entertain a motion.
Second.
So moved and seconded that we pass Board Bill 88 out with a do pass recommendation. Any discussion on the motion? If not, Madam Clerk, would you call the roll?
Alderwoman Krewson. Aye. Alderwoman Florida.
Aye.
Alderwoman Baringer.
Aye.
Alderman Williamson.
Aye.
Alderman Moore. Alderman French. Alderman Vaccaro.
Aye.
Alderman Carter.
Aye.
Chairman Kennedy.
Aye.
7 aye votes do pass.
Thank you.
By your vote, we've passed out Board Bill 88. We'll now take up Resolution 201.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I appreciate you giving us the opportunity to come before you this morning and talk about resolution number 201. This item here, the assessment maintenance plan, is required by state statute 137.115, which we do every 2 years, and we have it approved. It was approved by Board of E&A on December 18th, and once E&A approves it, it has to come before the Ways and Means Committee to have the resolution approved and approved by the board. This has to be done by February 1st each year. If it's not done by February 1st each year, then the State Tax Commission will take a look at the plan that we have, and they will make any changes that they deem necessary, and it becomes law at that time. This plan tells the State Tax Commission how the assessor's office is going to do their assessments for 2 years. This is a 2-year plan, and this plan covers calendar years 14 and 15. I've got with me this morning, come on up, Sean Ortway. Sean is really the brains of the assessor's office, since he's been around for a long time. He's the former assessor of Cohn County and also a member of, employed by the State Tax Commission for a number of years. So I'm fortunate, since I'm very new in this job, to have someone with me, keeping me on the straight and narrow, that knows how the assessor's office should run and those things that need to be done and when they need to be done. And I would ask for the committee to approve resolution number 201 this morning so that we can move forward. And that assures us that the $420,000 that we get from the state towards the assessor's office, which is about 10% of our budget, that we will get that for the years 2014 and 2015.
Were there any statements you wanted him to make before we started asking questions?
I'd just like to say I'm glad to be here in St. Louis, and I look forward to working with all of you. Thank you.
We can entertain questions. Alderwoman Krewson?
No questions.
Okay. Alderwoman Florida?
Yeah, I do have one question as it relates to the assessment of LRA parcels and the formula for LRA. And if you, I understand that you have state constraints, but taking into consideration that HUD has just paid for a market value analysis, I would argue that that might be a very strong tool to help us do a better job of real assessment for LRA parcels when recommending price point for sale.
You want to answer that?
Okay. Yeah. I would agree, and anything that we can get that helps us do our job better, we would be certainly interested in that. I have not seen that tool yet, but we'd like to see it and be involved in that process.
Okay.
That complete you?
Yes, so it sounds like it could be a work in progress.
All right.
Working with the state to come up with an LRA formula to better assess those parcels based on market value analysis, something a little more, a good, strong recommendation to the LCRA board.
Right.
Because I've heard some complaints in the randomness of the amounts that these parcels are going for.
Okay.
So,
All right. Alderman Baringer,
No questions.
Alderman Williamson,
No questions.
Alderman Vaccaro,
No questions.
Alderman Carter.
No questions.
Okay. Any closing remarks?
We just need your approval, and we would appreciate that.
Thank you. Okay, with that, then we can entertain a motion.
So moved.
second?
Been moved and seconded that we pass Resolution 201 with a due pass recommendation. Request for previous roll. Any opposition to previous roll? Seeing none by your vote, we have passed out Resolution 201, a due pass recommendation.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We will now have up our Budget Director, Paul Payne, to review the mid-year budget report.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, members of the committee.
Good morning.
I know I sent PDF versions of this material. I did also bring hard copies if for members to review, so let me...
I think everyone did get copies,
Is it the same thing? Okay.
but it's okay to pass it out.
Yeah, I sometimes I don't like to produce the paper, but just in case everyone needs copies.
Everybody had gotten copies, but we can take.
President Office, okay, he's on it, yeah. No, he has his own separate. I thought he was separate. He is. I just saying I couldn't figure out what Dave and all those guys are. Okay.
I'll let those get distributed before I begin.
Here. Which one is this? This is the one you already passed.
Those are different copies.
You had that one? You already
I already got this stuff.
You got color copies. Man.
Put out yours. Oh, what's this?
The teacher's pet, where they
Yeah,
give you papers
you
you
know.
get to hand out.
I was doing it, I would raise my hand.
I just want to get on the seat, that's why I did it. Is it the same thing? It doesn't look.
Yeah,
Let's
sorry.
leave them for the clerk.
Thanks, Joe.
And we get the inside.
Oh, Alderman Moore. Okay.
Remember a transfer report.
Okay, you should have before you 3 exhibits. Three exhibits. One is a summary. It's called First Half, FY14 First Half at a Glance, which is the document I'm going to be summarizing here. Basically summarizes both the revenue and expenditure outlook for the current fiscal year. There are also 2 supporting documents. One is a summary of the departmental expenditures for the general fund for the first half of the fiscal year. It's got a summary by department, and it's got also on the first 2 pages, and then in the body of the document, it has by line item where each department stands through the first 6 months of the fiscal year. And then finally, there's a report on budgetary transfers that have occurred since the beginning of the fiscal year. All transfers through, I believe, December 31st. All right, beginning with the fiscal first half at a glance, you can see the discussion begins with the revenues, starting with the earnings tax, which happens to be our largest source of revenue, about 32% of a general fund revenue. Earnings tax were actually up about 1.4%. which is good that it's up, but unfortunately, it's a little weaker than we anticipated in the budget. We're just over 2.1% in the budget. So we did see some growth there, but so you can see the indication the trend is up, but and compared to budget, it was not as strong as we'd hoped. On the earnings tax, about 85% of that revenue is from the individual and withholding portions of the tax. 15% of that is corporate. Now, corporate pays in April, so any early indications on the corporate earnings is probably skewed in terms of timing. There's a lot of refunds, things like that in the first part of the year. You really don't get a good sense on the corporate side until the latter part of the year. But based on the trends through the first 6 months, it would be falling short about $1 million, $1.4 million or so. So we're gonna have to keep an eye on that. And you can hope for corporate earnings to hopefully make up some ground there. On the payroll tax, it is the 0.5% as opposed to the earnings tax is 1%. There was a decline it's almost flat, 0.1%. Typically, the payroll tax tracks the earnings tax, although it's not exactly the same base. The payroll tax is not paid by nonprofits such as government entities. So it's not exactly works in tandem, although if you look at the long-term rate, it's slightly less than what the earnings tax would be. And as you can see through the report, with slightly down in the first half, it's trailing the budgetary estimate in the $1 million range. The sales tax was actually down by 0.7% and was trailing in the first half. One thing about the sales tax, however, is that the first month of the third quarter, which is January, I did have those numbers prior to completing this report. That month was up. So taking that into account, I do not expect a shortfall right now on the sales tax. But we're going to keep an eye on that. Also, obviously, a couple of years ago, when we did have a shortfall in the sales, surplus in the sales tax, one of the reasons for that was indicated as a winter that was warmer than normal. Well, it'll be interesting to see whether when we have a winter that's colder than normal, whether the reverse is true, and so that receipts hold up. But it was down 0.7% for the first half. But as I mentioned, the month of January was up several percent, and so I do expect it right now to meet budget estimates. On the property tax receipts, property tax are a little bit volatile in the first half simply because they're due at the end of December. So the receipts to date at that point were up 5.8%, and so that's a good thing. However, usually a better measure of the property taxes is taken at the end of January, which is the next couple of days. I was just looking at it earlier this morning. It's within budget parameters. It's not up to 5.8. It was about 2.5, something like that, which would put it within budget estimates. But that would give you an idea about where we stand on the property tax. Another category, well, I can mention the hotel and restaurant taxes. These are in addition to the sales taxes. These are specific. There's actually 3 of them. The hotel, 3.5% gross receipts tax, which goes in the general revenue through the Sports and Facility Trust Fund. There's a 1% sales tax, which goes to the Convention and Tourism Fund, most of which is also deposited in general revenue. And then there's a 0.5 cent restaurant tax, which is also deposited into general revenue. And what you see here is both that the hotel tax was up for the first half 7.8%, and the restaurant tax was up 4.3%, which are healthy performances for those 2 taxes. And so they were both collectively tracking above budget year to date. I think that's probably reflected of the actual activity. We had baseball postseason play this year. Also, you had a full season of the Blues this year. So I think that probably contributes to those type of activities. Franchise utility taxes are comprised of a number of the taxes we have on utilities within the city. The largest of which is Ameren UE receipts. Those were up 6.9% for the period and are actually exceeding budget estimates by the tune of about $1.6 million. Now, the gas receipts we're actually down through the first half. And we're trailing estimates by about $400,000. However, Laclede Gas, given that the severe weather we've had in recent weeks, I would expect those receipts to pick up in the second half. One of the troubling items on the franchise utility tax category would be the telecommunication tax receipts, which were down pretty much across the board by about 10%. And so we're looking at that. I've been talking with the Controller's Office about identifying where those weaknesses are. We have not seen it be any one particular company or anything, but it is just a decline. And those are falling short based on the pace of the first 6 months of about $1.1 million. So we're looking at that detail. Payments for airport and water are often affected by timing. Both airports were up 22%. Well, we don't expect 22% increase in airport receipts. It actually turns out that we had received 6 payments this year, year to date, versus 5 in the previous year. So that's why those numbers were up. The Water Division did see a drop. However, in talking with them, a lot of that was related to the wholesale receipts on a previous drought year, but they still do anticipate making revenue estimates. In the license receipts category, they were up actually 10.2%, or about $570,000 in the fiscal first half, and most of that was in the form of the amusement tax receipts, both the Rams receipts, which we had a full NFL season, whereas opposed to last year we only had 9 games, as well as an additional soccer game which added to those receipts there, which resulted in that increase in the amusement tax receipts. There were some moderate increases in both the cigarette license receipts and parking and restaurant gross receipts. Parking generally tracks hotel and restaurant. So in other words, if you have more activity in that category, you would likely see increase in parking. But in the license category, the single largest revenue item is the graduated business license, and that's usually not received until the fourth quarter. So you may see some increase or decrease in that source, but the big number comes in May. And so we will know that a little bit better when that will generally dictate the condition of that category when we get those receipts. Departmental receipts, as you're aware, there are every department, or almost every department, has some source of revenue. It could range from small dollar amounts to larger dollar amounts. But if you look at the departmental receipts, there are actually 4 areas where it produces about 60% of the departmental revenues. One is city courts, one is EMS, one is refuse, and one is building. Unfortunately for this outlook, about 3 of those 4 were down year to date. And a couple of issues wanted to report there. Refuse division, as I reported in the first quarter, there was an identification of about $850,000 in fees that were going to be allocated, that had been reallocated from previous years to water bills, and they were going through the process of making that correction. They had made half of it in the first quarter, and the other half was going to be made in the second quarter. But they've done that, and so the numbers reflect the fact of that adjustment. So those numbers were down. The refuse, refuse was also down. In addition to that, refuse were also down about another couple $100,000. So they're also trailing, just the base is trailing for the fiscal year. Now in the EMS category, there was a reduction of about $500,000 related to a Medicare revenue, which has been withheld from the Department of Centers for Medicare and Medicaid due to a recent audit on collections for the years 2008 and 2011. My understanding is that the process typically is that you appeal those findings and you work that out. However, they had withheld $500,000 in anticipation of that, well, as a result of that audit, but they have since stopped withholding. So we're back to normal collections, but you still have that issue on the outstanding $500,000, and the timing and the release of those funds is not certain at this time. In also the building division's revenues, which is another large category, primarily comprised of building permits and such, was down $1.3 million or 31% in the fiscal first half. However, in talking with the building division, they have identified a significant number of new projects they anticipate in the second half of the year. Some of the building projects are cyclical, and when they apply for the permit, it will affect when your revenues are reflected in those results. And in looking at the building division, you can see that and sometimes when they apply for the permits, you're going to see in the first half an increase and then a decline in the second half, or vice versa. In this instance, what we're looking at is they're projecting revenues to rise in the second half, and so therefore fall within the original estimates. And city court revenues, of the three, 70 court revenues were up about 4%, about $200,000, and are currently on pace to meet budget estimates. And those are the major categories, and then obviously there's a lot of details in there, but overall, if I were to describe what the first half was looking like, I would say we're not where you'd like to be. This time last year, I'd say we're either at or slightly above. Right now, I would say we're slightly below. I pegged the number at about $3 million shy. There's a lot of factors that could affect that. Again, certain revenues that haven't reported, property tax receipts later at the end of this month, the GBL, things like that. So we're gonna have to keep an eye on that, as well as the corporate earnings tax, which is gonna be also later in the fourth quarter. But I would say that there were more negative type of developments than positive. So in a typical year, when you see something like that, it's not anything near where you were 2 years ago when at the end of the first quarter you see, hey, we're off by $10 million. We need to take corrective action. But it is something that I think it's a bit of a concern, is that it's a bit tepid. Where we have growth, it's a little bit tepid, and it's not something where you're going to have projected any surplus at the moment. On the expenditures, most departments, again, are projected to stay within their appropriations with a few exceptions. We've got a few things, as you remember what we did with the budget. Pay increases, obviously, we did the mid-year merit pay, and there wasn't specific addition for funds for that, although departments were expected to work with that within their budget. That was about a 1%, which, and most of the departments can do that. Some particular departments I highlighted there, the fire department is currently tracking about $1.3 million over budget. A lot of that is in the form of overtime. However, they are also under their regular salaries, so that offsets that a bit, but they are still projected to be over in their overall spending. Corrections, their overtime accounts actually have come down a bit in the last 3 months. I think that has a bit to do with the fact that their census has dropped. We typically have budgeted about 1,900 total population for the two facilities. Through the fiscal first half, they were averaging 1,753. So they're not bulging at the seams right now. And I think that has curtailed some of the spending in their budget this year. And on the police department, if you recall, we did do that supplemental appropriation earlier. What actually wasn't a supplemental, but it rearranged some of the departments to reflect the acts of consolidation. And so you will see in these reports, those cost centers that have been established. I've noticed that sometimes the costs aren't getting charged correctly to the right account. I don't believe that's an expenditure issue, but I do believe it's more of an accounting issue. There's been some challenges with tracking the groups of employees because the employees under the police department had a different benefit package, and so I think as a matter of as a practical matter, they were established on a different cost center just so that can be tracked separately. So it sort of skews here the report, and so from the appropriation, as though there's a negative balance, but actually it was appropriated in the 650, they just broke it out separately. So I think we're gonna have to make sure that the cost centers end up getting charged correctly by the end of the year, but I do not think that's an expenditure issue. I think, again, that's an accounting issue. Streets and traffic, we've seen some increase in utility costs, in which I think, and they were tracking up, but I don't believe it was enough to make them go over. Also, I would anticipate that the recent storm activity, which is not reflected in the fiscal first half, will be a challenge in keeping expenditures within total appropriations. I was trying to add up funds that we've spent so far. I would expect somewhere between the area of $1 and $1.5 million on those type of efforts. Primarily $500,000 in salt and about $600,000 or $700,000 in overtime to date. ESD has also seen some contractual equipment repairs, particularly their Metro contract for fire equipment, which is tracking over budget by $203,000. However, that was within their total spending because they were under on personal services, and that would be sufficient to offset these costs. Overall, I would think in years in which you have revenues which are slightly trailing estimates, it's something, it makes it more important to track expenditures so that we don't end of the year in the deficit situation. And so by doing that, you're trying to control discretionary expenditures as much as possible. Now, the snow and winter season obviously hasn't helped us in that regard, and that, again, we're incurring some costs with regard to keeping the streets clean and such. But I think the effort to limit discretionary spending in the latter part of the year, just in case the revenues fall short, will be an effort that is ongoing. And that's primarily what I have for the fiscal first half.
Okay, thank you. Questions from members of the committee. Alderwoman Krewson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Paul, thanks for your very professional analysis of all of this. I think that, you know, we are fortunate to have you do such a good job on this. So it looks like revenues are projected to be down about $4.5 million for the year, unless something else happens, essentially. One of the things that I was wondering about, you know, in the past few years when the Cardinals have gone to the World Series and all that, we've had enjoyed, I guess, additional revenue as a result of that. And of course they did this year. And even though they went to the World Series and we did get those additional revenues in the first half of this fiscal year, these numbers are still down below what we projected, and I'm sure we didn't project for them to go to the World Series. So that kind of indicates that maybe the numbers are even a little worse than.
Yeah, I would say that it's funny. Well, first of all, your $4.5 million, and I neglected to mention that there were some use tax and gaming revenues were also down, which is a separate fund, and so those were included. In years, I would say that yes, you would be worse off had you not had that extra activity. Mm-hmm. Now, if you recall, in the previous fiscal year, we did still have postseason play, so the increment would not have been as great this year compared to last. So right. While you went further in the season, yeah, you would. But I think it also underscores the fact that it doesn't, you can't rely on just extra baseball to pull the whole budget up. I mean, sure, you are better off having had postseason play rather than not having postseason play. You are better off having a full season of hockey than only having a half season of hockey. Right. But when you look at a $479 million budget, if the trends are not sufficient, or if the trends are lagging or such, you're not gonna get pulled up just because of it.
Well, and that makes me, I guess, concerned about the sales tax revenue for the second half of the year, because the first half of the year you would think has been good because of those, you know, all hockey and all baseball. And the second half then is, you know, unless something changes, but with the cold weather, et cetera, then the second half is not really that likely to recover unless there's some, you know, market conditions going on that we're not able to see right now that would boost that up. So it's concerning. Yeah, no,
and I agree with you. The only caveat on that is that I do have the results from January, as I mentioned. Typically we get the reports on the sales tax by the 10th of that month. So while it wasn't in the first half, I did see the first month of the third quarter, and it was up. So I'll take a number of approaches when you look at a revenue and trying to project how we're going to end up. I've got a rather large history of how it's performed over the years, and when you have 7 months of results, what typically would that project for that full year? And it was close to budget estimate, plugging those numbers in. So again, I still think there are some unknowns, and particularly the winter weather, whether that has a negative impact as opposed to having a positive impact a couple of years ago. Sure. So I do share your concerns on just the overall trend on revenues.
The other thing, and you and I emailed about this, is the earnings tax is up, and that's good. That indicates that employment, it's up a little bit, 1.4%. That indicates that employment is up, or at least salaries are up a little bit, combination. But the payroll tax is flat. So it could look like the increase in job growth is in the not-for-profit sector. I mean, we know that's colleges, universities, hospitals, all the big sectors that we have. You know, I guess it's unfortunate that they don't also pay payroll tax. And that's a long ago made decision, but I guess they consider it income tax, and since they're tax exempt, they don't pay that on their employees. That's probably debatable.
Right. Yeah, as I had mentioned to you earlier, the payroll tax typically is about a 1% drag in terms of the over long-term growth, 10, 15 years under the earnings tax. So yeah, that's something you notice when you look at those historical trends.
Thank you for your good analysis.
Thank you.
That completes you?
It does. No further questions.
Alderwoman Florida.
Yeah, thank you. So, Paul, I know that you're preparing for budget now, and you're tracking the different departments. Are you kind of projecting what our deficit will be? And it's February, or close to February. And so if you were going to give a number for the deficit, would you be willing to give a number? Should we be preparing for a deficit in budget?
Well, the way the process works is that each year I'll go, as I went through this mid-year review,
right,
I'll make an estimate, and then based on that, make an estimate for the next fiscal year in terms of what we expect in revenues. And then as you know, as you're quite familiar with, typically when you look at the base budget and compare it to what your projected revenues are, there's a gap. I suppose that's what you mean by deficit. And so in trying to come with budget allocations, obviously you issue numbers that say, hey, your bottom line allocation is going to be meeting this revenue. So if there's a gap, that means you're going to reduce the budget. And so what I've done in this last week or so is I've issued to departments a request of about 3.5% reduction. And now that doesn't, all departments. For instance, like police, I think I kept them a little higher. They had some items which they prepaid in the fiscal year. And things like that I'll make adjustments for. Known increases, other things like that. But most departments were asked about 3.5%. Now that also assumes that the starting revenue base was knocked down by about $3 million, which I did simply because this year's revenue looks a little weak, and so which creates a little bit higher hurdle. Now, fortunately, I do get one more quarter to review the revenues, and when I get to that point, we'll end up with a final number, and sort of that's when the rubber hits the road, and we actually make the final decisions in terms of how we're going to get a balanced budget. But yes, and so we have just started that process. There was a gap, and I've asked departments about a 3.5% reduction.
Okay. Alderwoman Baringer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just was a little curious when I was looking at the corrections department, and I just want to know, when we look at prisoner medical, and it's 3.6 million, are we seeing that? Do we get a match or reimbursement from anyone when we do the medical for the prisoners?
What we receive from the state is a reimbursement just on general housing, I believe, and again, off the top of my head, I think it was something like 19 and change or something like that per day, per diem for those who are sentenced to the state facility. But it's, I don't believe it's just detailed. It's just a per diem that is reimbursed for to the city for housing state prisoners
So
or inmates.
we bear the full cost of all medical.
We bear, our costs are much higher than the reimbursement rate that we get from the state, yes.
Okay. And have we seen that go up or down?
On medical costs, or over the years, yeah, you will have seen significant increases. Now, it will be impacted by census. So if there were a couple years back where, again, you're bursting at the seams and your medical costs were higher simply because you had more inmates. Now, this year, we've actually seen lower inmates at census, and so that should have some impact. Again, it also depends on how it's structured, how the medical things are structured. It may be a graduated, you reach this level, it's this charge, you reach this level, it's this charge. But that changes with each contract negotiation. I understand there is contract negotiation underway in the current fiscal year, and so that will be changing again soon.
Okay. And can you tell me where the revenue comes from to fund SEMA?
SEMA is a state program. We changed, budgetarily, we changed how it was budgeted. I think it was just this year, because we originally had it budgeted as we expend it and then reimbursed. And I believe the guidance was that we ought to treat that as a grant. And so it comes from, I think the federal government provides the state with state emergency funds, and then those are allocated to local emergency agencies through state SEMA, S-E-M-A, to our local SEMA. And that's how it works. But it's considered a grant fund.
Okay. Thank you. That's all I have.
Alderman Williamson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What's your projection as far as the half-cent sale tax? Do you think we'll have an increase, or will it stay flat dealing with all 28 wards, or do you project us receiving less money or more?
The long-term growth rate on our sales tax is not great. It's around about 0.5%. Now, one of the things dragging down the allocations last year, if you recall, was that sales tax fell short the prior year. And what that does, and it creates a problem, is that when the sales tax falls short, we don't come back and say, hey, we need to take from your current appropriation. What we do instead is the following year, we reduce the appropriation to make up for that deficit. That's because you might have some capital project underway, and that would create a difficulty. Currently, I do not expect there to be a deficit in the sales tax. Again, as our earlier discussion, there's a lot of variables there. So hopefully, even though you may not see much growth, you don't have to make up for a prior year deficit, so you may see a little growth, you may see your allocation go up a bit. Again, that's going to be dependent on where we end the year. So hopefully, you would see some slight increase next year in that allocation.
And in discussion earlier, where you were talking about like the hockey and the baseball, would that keep some of the city employees from going on furlough like we did several years ago?
Yeah, and last year, in that year in which it occurred, yeah, the furlough was a sort of an unusual, as you know, an unusual circumstance. It was something that you don't want to do, and only in dire situations. And I think everyone would agree that fiscal 9 and 10 were pretty dire situations. I don't anticipate that something like that is on the horizon like right now.
Great, that's good to hear. Use taxes is down. So would that affect the demolition revenue?
Yeah, I think it would affect the fact that, similar to the sales tax, you don't have a surplus or anything like that to offset what is projected to be sluggish or no growth in the use tax. So I can't see there being an increase over current levels of what the demolition fund was getting this year.
So kind of flat, probably remain the same.
Yeah, I mean, the only increase in the base that we had anticipated on the use tax was the fact that with the increase of the 3/16 sales tax, which went into effect in October, the use tax rate also increases. And so there was, in this year, I'd anticipated, I think, about an $800,000 increase there simply because the rate went up. And that was about 7 months. I think in that regard, it's probably falling short. As I mentioned, the use tax is about 1.5 million short going, projected through the first 6 months. But in terms of growth of the tax itself, I do not anticipate anything there.
Okay. All right, thank you, Paul, appreciate it.
Alderman Moore, are there any questions?
I didn't, but I thought of one.
Okay.
The police department,
Yes.
with the new strategy on the hot spots and the this new, what do we call it, French, redistricting, how will that affect the budget? Are we gonna use less or more money to do this type of policing?
I'm not as familiar with how that would affect budgetarily. They are going to be participating in the budget process just like every other department, and we've given them an allocation just like every other department. And I expect that they're going to see that as being a challenge to meet. And so anything that they can do to that would produce savings in order to meet that, I would expect that they would probably do. And but again, in that particular instance, I don't know budgetarily what that impact may be. I do know that it's involved, there's a redeployment involved in getting more officers on the street and such, but in terms of a budget standpoint, I'm not familiar with how that would impact.
Are we about finished with budgeting budget for the new police station?
You mean the headquarters?
Yes, sir.
There are a few outstanding items that I know that are aware of. We are also going over some capital needs citywide that we are currently reviewing, and I believe there were a couple items related to that structure as well that we need to consider. I know they're looking for some place to put their evidence room, which is currently over in the headquarters, which is not going to be moved over to the new headquarters. There are also some other items with just actually shutting down the old headquarters. They've also got that tower around the building that needs to be relocated. So there are a few items such as that have to be funded, and that funding needs to be identified.
Will we sell the old building to gain, or will we demolish it, or is some developer interested in it?
I don't think that's been decided, although I'm sure if you...
Of money.
Yeah, I'm sure if anyone is out there that could offer that as a development project, I'm sure those would be entertained.
Okay. Yes.
Okay. Alderman French.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. So following up on Alderman Moore's questions about the police department, so in past years, what seems to have been occurring there was that as pension costs increased, that department kind of ate those increases with changes internally?
What we've tried to do is trying to contain it. Yeah, saying, hey, look, these costs are going up, so let's try to, if we're going to give you, we typically deferred and gave them a little higher increase than everyone else. It was like a 3% or something like that, and said, try to contain that with pensions, health, everything in that unit. And so that's what we tried to do. And we're always successful there, but that's typically what the
I was looking in here and I didn't see the police pension. Do we estimate, what percentage do you estimate the increase for this year?
I have not seen the numbers. I know they had a meeting yesterday, but the pension board doesn't issue its report for distribution to the city until next month. I think, and this is true for all three systems, we should see a leveling out of the pension costs simply because if the way the smoothing happens, I know fire was 3 years, so we're done with that, but on ERS and PRS, it was a 5-year smoothing. This is the last year of incorporating, I think, from 2009, those losses into the system. Matter of fact, on our ERS, we do have the number, and it's, I think this year was 15.56, and it's going to be something percent of payroll. So it's flat, pretty much. I expect police, depending on how the results of this last valuation occur, maybe slightly up. They were projected to be up just as that last year was worked into the valuation. But again, they had a positive year of performance, so that will mitigate a little bit of that. But I would maybe less than $1 million, something like that.
And it would be the same strategy, though, if there is an increase, they would...
I would expect so.
Try to eat it. You know, there's always, I think Alderwoman Krewson mentioned this, but, you know, there's always this, usually a lot of talk in the media when we have either the World Series or some sporting event about the increases. But it doesn't look like it's actually that much. It might be a few $100,000 here and there.
Actually, no, I mean, it is. Let me sort of break it out. I think the World Series playoffs and such, and people ask, well, how much does that bring in typically? It could be more than $3 million. But remember, our sales tax and there's a number of rates in there. There's the rate that goes to by state. There's the rate that goes to the Board of Ed. There's the rate that goes, so that's not all general revenue. So yes, it's a big event, but it's not an event that would dictate necessarily how you end up the year. If everything else was meeting estimates or slightly beating estimates, then you could say, hey, you know, you may end up with some surplus that you could probably direct towards that activity. But with the variables, for instance, the earnings tax, any negative development there would far outweigh anything that would be coming in from that kind of activity on a sales tax from a World Series game or such, because it's just not, the magnitude isn't as great.
Sure. I mean, these things aren't necessarily game changers. Like
no, I mean, they're good things to have. Don't get me wrong. They're definitely, they're great and they add to the bottom line. But it is not something that's going to have that overweighted or an impact on a $479 million budget.
Yeah, I didn't think so. In your transfer report, I had a couple of things here. Over the course of the first few months, it looks like over in the water division, they've been transferring a lot of money from the professional services line item over to facility maintenance. In fact, I've counted 4 transfers totaling $1 million. You know anything about that?
Which ones are you? There's a number. There should be.
So numbers 13 and 14, and numbers 113 and 114. Each of them for $250,000. Now remind me, isn't the professional services that was the controversial line item dealing with the contract for?
Yeah, I believe so. Now, although these transfers are transferring out of professional service lines.
Right, it's transferring over to facility maintenance.
Yeah, I could not speak to the details other than the fact that they were saying that that's for service line repair, it looks like. And that's because that's the line item they're putting in is for facility maintenance, which is, as it's defined here, as service lines. So they apparently they transferred it over to repair service lines.
Is that something that's contracted out?
Well, it's in contractual services, so I would suspect that's true.
And the other thing that raised an alarm here is it's classified as a non-EA?
Yes.
That does not go in front?
Well, as a non-E&A transfer is something which occurs within a family of accounts. So let's say you've got $10,000 in office supplies and you need $10,000 in facility and ground supplies. That's the kind of thing which we said, all right, that if they submit that to the budget division, the controller's office, and they sign off on it, then that wouldn't require a separate E&A. But yeah, and so in this instance, on the contractual services, if it was a 5,600 account, it wouldn't have required an E&A transfer.
You think you can get us a little bit more information about what?
I could, sure. Now, I think in our file, what you're going to have is, this is it. This is what we've got. I mean, they submit a transfer form, so I'm guessing, but I will definitely check those original forms, and if we don't have that, we could ask the Water Division to provide some additional material.
We could have them come in.
We can ask for that specifically, too. Okay, that's all I had. Thank you.
Alderman Vaccaro?
Paul, have you started next year's budget stuff yet? I mean,
Well, as I indicated earlier, we have started the allocation process, and we've requested them to submit their budget requests in.
and, you know, when I asked you before, restoring the ward capital, is that gonna happen, or we need to start?
I think it's a little early to determine. I would, again, as I say here, there's nothing more I'd like to see is capital restoration. I think that's something over the long term that we need to address. And unfortunately, capital is the thing that gets the short change when you're struggling on the operational side. So it's a balance, I mean, what you do. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I do think you're going to have a benefit, and again, this is subject to the sales tax performance, of not having to have a deficit in the sales tax fund, so you should see an increase in your allocation even before anything else gets considered with regard to the ward cap, because last year there was a negative adjustment because there was a shortfall in the previous year. Hopefully that does not happen. And then through the first 7 months, I don't think it will, but we'll keep an eye on that. In terms of whether or not there's reallocation and such like that, I would like to say no, but I can't quite get there yet. I think with the revenues this year falling a little short, about $3 million, that sort of puts you in another hole that you really wouldn't want to be in otherwise. So I think it's a little early to know where it's going to end up.
I mean, if it's not fixed there, we need to fix it.
Let me...
because, like I said earlier, the roads, just in my ward, and I'm sure anybody else's wards, are horrible. And, you know, when I get $200,000 or 214, and 40 goes to dumpsters, 30 goes to trees, and then, like I said before, I split with, you know, a couple of wards. We did Arsenal and we did Lansdowne. Hampton, if it gets any worse, you know, I mean, at this point, if we don't get this back and start fixing the roads, people are going to start leaving. I mean, it's important we get ward capital back.
Let me tell you what we're also doing on the capital side. The capital committee has been meeting on a regular basis over the last few months regarding a capital needs inventory citywide. And so we've got a whole list of projects that were submitted, and we're going through the process of evaluating. That's anything from replacing fire department vehicles and repairing roofs on firehouses to whatever the police needs, to streets and bridges, which we met on yesterday, and city building repairs. What we are doing right now is we're evaluating all of those, trying to put priority numbers on those, and contemplating what financing would be available, particularly as regards a general obligation bond issue, which we would anticipate is a possibility later this year. Again, and streets, bridges, particularly those which are eligible for reimbursements on a 4-to-1 basis, it's almost a no-brainer. If you got the money and you can get a 4-to-1 match, it makes sense to set aside some money to get those. Unfortunately, we don't have operating funds to do that. So we're going through this process step by step, trying to identify it. Of course, there's only so much you can do with the existing tax levy, and so we're trying to identify priorities. Streets is on it, and I think we're aware of that. We talked about those particular, and bridges as well, about which ones are structurally deficient and what need to be addressed in that kind of financing. So the capital committee is addressing some of those, and hopefully we'll have some sort of packet for this committee to review, and everyone else to start to get into the loop and so we can get these capital needs addressed.
I look forward to it, because like I said, if the roads in the 23rd Ward get any worse than they are, and we don't have the ability to fix them, it's gonna affect property values, and it's gonna affect people moving in. I mean, we can't continue to just let the streets and alleys deteriorate throughout the city. That's all I have.
Okay. Porter.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Hey, Paul. I'm looking at this transfer of $250K through streets and traffic. Was that all from this last snowstorm, or was that just a general?
We've done 2 transfers for streets related to the snowstorm, and both of them were to replenish salt inventory.
Okay, how much were they?
$250,000 each. Going into the fiscal year, and just so you know, we keep a pretty good reserve of inventory, and I think Todd will tell you, hey, he's not going to run out of salt, and I think we're pretty good about maintaining the inventory. But what he's done in terms of the last snowstorm is that his inventory has been going down. So he'll give me a call, hey, we need to. So we look for where he can get it from, and he had some savings in his, because he had vacancies in his salary account. So we transferred monies out of that so he can get salt, and that's I believe that one that you're referencing is for.
Salt and chemical supplies?
Yes.
Okay. So if we have another storm, let's say similar, we're looking at similar costs, right?
Well, we've done 2 of those. I think we should, I'm told that we should, and of course, you knock on wood, but we think we're covered for the year.
Right.
Now, if we get a lengthier season than usual, what you might end up seeing is him coming back and say, hey, for next year, I'm gonna need to add this much. And hopefully we can avoid that, and Mother Nature cooperates, but that's yet to be seen.
Right, and you mentioned bonds and capital bonds. Would crime cameras be included in those bonds? I know you mentioned that streets and other stuff.
I don't know if
looking in it.
Cameras would be included in that. There was a request for a monitoring facility, such as like at the headquarters, to where all cameras, you'd have one central, and we can get into this when we talk about this, but a central location where anyone who has these systems of cameras up there, there'll be some central monitoring facility. At the police department to review that. That was one of the proposals that was on the police department's list.
Okay.
But again, when you look at bond funds, you also have to be cognizant that you are paying debt on these items, and the useful life of whatever you buy can't be less than your debt service. So some items are equipment items that are probably paid for from other funds, and then longer term capital items are the ones that would be funded with any bond funds.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions from members of the committee? Alderman Krewson?
Thank you. Paul, is the maximum amount that any transfer can be $250,000 by some kind of statute or something?
Yes, it's actually itemized in the board bill, the budget bill.
Okay, I see. So that's what sets that. So if you need to transfer more than that, you have to do it in
increments. And that was by design. I think the idea was that it calls attention to it, and so that they have to defend that.
Yeah, I think that's okay. Also, when you prepare by the way, this list of transfers is really helpful. When you prepare the next year's budget and you give us the actual to compare that to, these transfers are included in that, not only the actual, but also in the prior year's budget? I mean, do you take into account the transfers so that when you're looking at it, you know where things ended up?
We haven't yet. If you remember, if you look at the budget document, I think we have 2 years of actual expenditures, the budget year, and then the proposed budget. Right. I know where you're going at, because I haven't figured out how to get there.
Counters.
Yeah. In terms of, that would be another column, and you might lose one of the expenditure columns.
Yeah, okay.
But yeah, what we do when we review the departments with, budgets with departments when they propose their budgets is that we'll look at some of these transfers and, wait a minute, why are you requesting this same amount when you transferred money into it last year, that type of thing.
Okay.
But I do know your question, and
In that way.
something we
All
might
right.
consider.
I mean, I understand transfers, there's nothing bad about them. You cannot foresee everything when you're doing the budget, you know, like in February for the, you know, period of time that's 18 months out. So I
Right.
completely understand that there have to be transfers. Just like we all transfer in our ward capital accounts. We don't think of everything at the beginning of the year, you know, that may come up. So I don't think transfers are negatives. I just think they have to be taken into account in
Reflected.
future budgeting cycles.
That's a good point, yes.
Thank you.
Did that complete you?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Were there any other questions from members of the committee? There are a couple of other Alder people here. Were there any questions from Alderman Boyd?
Sure, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to say this is a great exercise. I'm glad I came today. It gives a pretty good picture of what's going on with the city mid-year. Paul, just a few questions. Number one, it seems like on the transfers, they pretty much stay within the department.
Typically they do, yeah. When a department has a need for something that comes up that wasn't anticipated, the first recourse is find it within your funds. That doesn't mean it won't, if something's anticipated and it's a large event, that doesn't mean it couldn't be done with other departments kicking in, but typically the first recourse is to go within that department, yes.
Okay, and you had mentioned that you've asked each department to hold back 3%, is that right?
The allocations for next year went out a week or so ago, and most departments would see about a 3.5% reduction.
And as you're looking at where we may end up at the end of the year, it has been alleged that you often ask departments to stop spending so that you can make sure we don't have a budget shortfall. Then that creates, I guess, a whole bunch of transfers at the end of the year.
Well, what happens is, and this has been true for a number of past years, is that when your spending is getting so tight to the appropriation limit, because under no circumstances can you go over the appropriation limit. That's your authorization. What is issued is, I believe the controller's office says, we're cutting off invoices at this date simply because if all of them were submitted and paid, it's possible that, you're expending over your total appropriation, which can't happen. So a letter goes out, it depends on which year. Some years it's been earlier when we've known we had revenue shortfalls, and a typical year might go out in May or so, saying we're stopping the invoices. And then departments still would submit the invoices, but they would be paid by closely monitoring where we were in the total expenditure, so that we're making sure that you're not going over your total appropriation. And so let's say there are certain items, let's say transfer station and refuse. That's a large item. I think every bill is maybe $500,000 and all. Well, you want to make sure that when you pay that bill, that's not putting you over the top. So while the letter went out, typically they'll say, okay, where are we? And in June, you're saying, well, are we close? Are we close? How much more can you fit? And then you say, well, have you paid all those big bills? And so it's a little bit closely monitored. I wouldn't say everything's just shut down. It's more of closely monitoring to make sure that you don't go over. And then some departments will, by virtue of the fact that they didn't get something paid, will end up having to pay it out of the subsequent fiscal year.
Thank you. And the other question is, during the budget process, who are the key players in helping develop the budget for next year?
Obviously, it starts here with the budget division putting it together, and we meet with them. We also, the departments that report to the mayor, we obviously have the director of operations in place at that point when going over budget requests and such. And then I also briefed the members of E&A prior to submitting it to the board to make sure it reflects what their priorities are, and there's nothing that we're doing that would upset that as well. And so that was primarily how we do that.
I ask that is because I understand the priorities of the mayor, I understand the priorities of different departments, they understand the issues that they deal with annually. However, I think that aldermen understand, you know, their wards and what the real needs are in the wards. And I was just curious as to if there was an alderman, obviously the president of Board of Aldermen is involved in discussions, but that doesn't come in until you basically have designed the budget.
Well, I mean, that's the process of the budget. I mean, basically E&A, Oliver presented to E&A presents its recommendation, and then you all have your input on the budget.
The challenge to that, in my mind, is that by the time we get it, by the time E&A get it, looks at it, massage it, do what they want to do with it, and it comes to us, I mean, the ball is rolling downhill. And sometimes it's too late to do certain things. So I certainly like to offer that a priority in my ward, for example, is building demolition. And I'm getting hit pretty hard with a tremendous amount of buildings in my ward that need to come down, and I'm only getting an allocation of maybe 6 buildings. And I'm sure other aldermen are experiencing the same thing. Now, we did this use tax deal, and we got $3 million years ago, and it keeps getting cut. Now, there are major projects within departments all over the city. To me, building demolition is a major project. And I think we need to be more sensitive to how we allocate, you know, the funds for building demolition. I really want, you know, everybody to be sensitive to that as this budget comes out next year.
Let me add to that as well. Building demolition specifically has been included as an item for consideration in the citywide capital needs inventory and the potential bond issue. If you remember, the last time we did that in '98, I thought we had $11 million assigned in building demolition, and so we've identified, I think, in excess of a need anyway of about 20 million, and of course that's being evaluated by the committee, but there's a potential for including that within that package as well to start addressing that very issue.
There also was a rumor that pay raises may be offered next year. If we offer pay raises, looking at where we are in the middle of this year, is that still a priority to give pay raises?
Well, I'm not in the negotiation process this year, and so obviously that's underway. I can tell you what we did this year. I mean, if you're familiar, if you recall, we had the merit increases based on anniversary date, and that was 2%, which, as I mentioned when I went over this year's expenditures, in terms of the year in which you're in, it's about a 1% in terms of the impact, and we expect the departments to take that hit, basically absorb that. And from experience in the prior year, most departments are able to do that. In preparing for next year, obviously, we have to take that into account, however. So next year's budgets will reflect the full year's cost of this year's 2%. Now, if, let's say that next year is the same scenario, I would not expect to have to set aside funds for next year's, and if it's, let's say it's the same magnitude, and let's say it's the 1%, whatever, you would again say, okay, departments, you need to work within that 1% within your department. But it does add to the base growth of the department. It's just that it's a year lag. So it is something to consider when you look at the budget and say what your priorities are.
Alderman French, I get a follow-up.
Yeah, following up on Alderman Boyd's question, I saw a tweet from the mayor's office yesterday about making sure that no city employee made less than $10.10 an hour. First, I don't know how many employees would make less than that, but do you have any estimate about how much that would increase our cost to raise pay?
No, I think I've seen something on that reason. I think personnel, and I don't have the number, but it was very small. I think maybe it was per performance type people, because I don't think there's any full-time people that make less than that.
I'd be surprised if they
Yeah, because I don't think it would have that much of it. My recollection is that it would be insignificant. There may have been some per performance or something, but not significant at all.
That is a proposal put on the table.
Right.
We'll hear more about that later, though.
Right.
Alderman Moore?
Yes, Paul, you know, I was looking at the budget that Terry gave us prior to coming here. And I look at the numbers that you guys have, police and the headquarters and all, and look like you took a template and did year after year after year. The numbers are the same. How does that work? Do you guys actually go into that and figure out the numbers, or is it pretty close to the same thing, so you just repeat it?
Oh, you're talking about in terms of when you're comparing prior years
Yes.
over the time and not seeing much of a change over the years?
Exactly, it looks like a template, just over and over again,
Yeah,
to the penny.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say it to the penny, but I would say that if what you've noticed is that there hasn't been much growth on the budget side, I would say, yeah, you're right. And I think that's because there hasn't been much growth on the revenue side as well. In fiscal 9 and 10, we actually had reductions because during the recession that was pretty severe, we had to make reductions across the board in order to make our budget balance. And we've begun to pull away from that, and so we've seen some modest increases since. But yeah, I mean, if you're 1 or 2%, something like that, that would be considered growth and significant growth compared to what the environment we're in.
Okay. In your testimony, I think you mentioned something about the fire department having a lot of overtime.
Yes.
How much, the percentage of that, or?
I believe, did I have the number there? They're tracking over by about $2.3 million in overtime. However, their salaries, because they had fewer firefighters on staff, was reduced. So you have they're tracking about 1.3 million over in total in personal services. Now, I do know that they've added a class this year to address that, but they have also been impacted by a number of recent larger fires, as well as some of when you have a cold winter like this as well, they have a lot of fires in vacant buildings and such that they've been impacted too. So over and above we usually have an issue with overtime with the fire department, but even in addition to that, we've had these conditions, which has sort of made it a little worse than usual.
Okay. All right. I certainly don't think any member of the committee expects you to have every little detail about every transfer and everything that's happening within each department. But I think for the most part, we believe you're doing an excellent job, at least keeping us informed and providing us the information, that we're requesting. It was part of my thinking in kind of beginning these review processes with you as a part of this committee that if there's any other detailed information on a particular department, that we could always bring them in and get more details if we wanted it. So we will be having another Ways and Means Committee, I think in about 2 weeks. I believe it's about like that. But certainly we can bring in any committee any department that we wish to get some more detailed information based upon what we've seen here today. Are there any other further questions from members of the committee, or any other comments, or any other alderman that is presently here? I see a couple of others. If not, then that really completes our review of the mid-year report. We appreciate all the information that you have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Now, there is a third quarter report, or there is one?
I usually wrap that in, it becomes in April, and given that I'm presenting the budget at the same time in April, I sort of I don't do a separate third quarter report, I sort of tie that into the budget presentation for the following year.
Okay then. We want to have some other discussions with you, because that was a concern we also had about at what point the Board of Aldermen gets into the budget process. We're really, in a crunch by the time it gets here. So we're looking at ways to get for this board to be involved a little earlier, so that we can also have the public portion of what we began to do here a little bit earlier as well. But we'll talk to you more about that.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We'd like to thank you. And if nothing else, that completes our hearing for today. Thank you. Our meeting's adjourned.